It isn't autobiography. It's definitely fiction, and yet elements of oneself are used carefully and aesthetically in making something new. My name is Amy Brown, and my novel My Brilliant Sister is published by Scribner Australia. Miles Franklin's My Brilliant Career inspired My Brilliant Sister. Unsurprisingly, I picked up My Brilliant Career when I was in my late 20s, and being from New Zealand, I didn't have that background knowledge of Miles Franklin. I hadn't studied her at school. I knew her name from the country's two sort of top fiction prizes, and I had seen kind of a severe portrait of her, but otherwise the novel was completely new to me. And I sort of sometimes get a bit superstitious about books coming to you at the right time in life. And for me, it was just serendipitous because I was on the cusp of sort of abandoning a career in academia, and I was recently married or about to become married. And sort of oddly, the two sisters in this novel that I should say was published in 1901 reminded me of different parts of myself. And that was back in 2014. And I was sort of struck by how Sibylla, who's the protagonist of My Brilliant Career, based on Stella Miles Franklin herself, as this sort of bohemian, firebrand, ruthless writer figure, reminded me of kind of caricature of part of myself. Whereas Gertie, this younger sister character, who is a kind of pretty peacemaker, I think she's called in the novel, and a good girl who wants to make her mother proud and marry well, sort of oddly reminded me of another part of myself. So I think that's why I became slightly obsessed with this novel. But the other thing is that I wanted to know whether there was a real Gertie. So I knew that Sibylla was based on Stella. I didn't know if there was another Franklin sister. And I just became interested in that question. So that led me to Jill Rowe's biography of Miles Franklin initially, and then the Mitchell Library, where I got into the Franklin archives and read the letters between the sisters. And so that um, formed the middle section of My Brilliant Sister. My novel is a novel in that it is fictional, even though there are auto-fictional and historical elements to it. It has characters, it has narrative, though perhaps an unconventionally shaped narrative, and it's inspired by a number of different novels as well, not only My Brilliant Career, but other things that I've been reading over the last 8 years that I've been writing. Some of those are auto-fictional. I'm thinking of Jenny Offal's Weather and the Department of Separation, which I just loved and was reading at around about 2020 when I was thinking of how the novel could have these contemporary elements. And the novel does reference a number of other kind of literary works in it, particularly Jenny Erpenbeck's The End of Days, which was also influential. So yeah, it's an oddly shaped novel, but I think it's definitely a novel. I think I was drawn to Linda Franklin, who is the Franklin sister that Gertie was based on, partly because of the mystery around her. There's this sort of missing voice, I guess, and in that Stella Miles Franklin, who has written My Brilliant Career, is able to speak for herself. And she speaks of her sister, I think, in places quite dismissively. There's one line in particular where she, I'm going to paraphrase badly here, but she describes her sister as not being able to feel an ounce of what she does. So not having these depths of misery or these heights of ecstasy. And it was when I read that and then paired that up with a letter that I had read by Linda Franklin to her sister uh, in response to receiving the novel for the first time, where she says, "You're pretty hot on me in places." And it made me wonder, what if she had the opportunity to reply in more detail? And what if she had in fact been, I guess, just as capable possibly of writing as her sister, but kind of corseted by expectation rather than a lack of interest in kind of literary or artistic pursuits. So I think it was that speculating about what Linda's aspirations might have been, and sort of imagining where their paths diverged, that made me so curious about her. So the third section of the novel is about a contemporary version of Stella, who is not a writer but a singer-songwriter. She is a New Zealander who's been touring the world, very successful for the last few years. And then when the pandemic hits, she's forced to return home and lock down in small town New Zealand, essentially, with not many people other than her mother to speak with. Um, and yeah, that was sort of pure fantasy and fun for me in a lot of ways to imagine a contemporary woman who has devoted herself to her art at the expense perhaps of other intimate relationships in her life, though she is kind of heartbroken and recovering from an affair that she's had on her recent tour. And she's in this kind of state of isolation and lockdown, considering what her identity is away from her performative self. So when she's not on the stage, when she doesn't have an audience sort of validating her, who is she and what's left of the kind of meaning in her life? And really, I had fun basing her on a number of different musicians that I love. I won't name one in particular, but I like to leave it open for readers to sort of speculate about that. She's pure fiction, but she's certainly based on people I kind of admire, and um, is supposed to be a sort of counterweight to the contemporary narrator of the first section. So Ida, who narrates the first section, I think she is a kind of, well, no, I wouldn't like to say every woman, but she definitely seems to be resonating with a lot of readers since the book has come out, and I've been talking with friends and booksellers and readers and journalists. She's the one that a lot of people seem to be relating to, particularly if they have small children themselves, or even have grown-up children but remember having small children, because of that kind of vexed tussle between domestic labour and other pursuits that you might want to lead, which was, of course, kind of heightened during the pandemic when kind of all parts of your life were kind of centred in the home. And I think that's partly why I chose to set Ida's story in 2021, not only because I was writing then, but because that experience in Melbourne really amplified any sort of domestic imbalances. So I think she does seem to resonate with a number of readers. I think the idea of it has been around for 10 years, and then I was easing into it slowly. So I've been writing on and off for the last 8 or so years. I initially presented on when I thought it was going to be just a purely historical novel at a historical fiction conference at Melbourne University back in, I think it was 2015 maybe. And it's interesting to me that I did have parts of the middle section of the novel that I read aloud then that have endured over time. It's changed a lot in terms of structure and I guess characters, and it's grown, but the central question of how women balance different parts of their lives has remained. I've published other works in the past, so I've got 3 collections of poetry and 4 children's novels, but it's a different thing to be published by Scribner Australia and to have I guess, more attention for the book and to have readers communicating with me about it and to be able to do things like this. And it's a cliche, but it really is a bit of a dream because I'm such a voracious reader and an English teacher as well, and I've grown up with books. So to have one received so warmly at the moment is just lovely. Such a hard question because I love so many and I'm quite so many different books and I have an eclectic taste, but something that I read recently that I've been talking a lot about because I just wish I'd read it you know, earlier in my life, I suppose, is Tove Jansson's The Summer Book, which is again, it came to me at the right time in my life, I think, where it was exactly what I wanted. So for those who've never read Tove Jansson's The Summer Book, it's this exquisite sort of philosophical and yet light series of vignettes between a granddaughter who's about 6 years old, I think, so Sophie, and her grandmother who is elderly at the other end of her life, definitely. And it's set, I think, in the 1950s on a tiny Finnish fishing island. So it's sort of extraordinary how much I related to it. And yet the way in which the weather and the landscape is so intricately described and the relationship between these two characters without any sentimentality is just so beautifully depicted. It's the kind of book that I've been buying for everyone since I've read it because it just means so much to me. In publishing My Brilliant Sister, I think the biggest surprise that I had was how much writing took place during the editing process. So last year I was hugely lucky to work with a really gifted editor, Meredith Rose, who helped guide the book into the form that it's in today. So it was a much longer manuscript and essentially the same in form, but she's just an um, absolutely eagle-eyed and sensitive and clever, and helped me with what needed to happen, especially to the first section, which is had always been the hardest for me because of its slightly auto-fictional nature, and it wasn't sitting easily with me at the time that it had been picked up by the publisher. And so a lot of work was done on that last year even, which I wasn't expecting, but which I'm really grateful for. When I say the first section's auto-fictional, it's a tricky label because I think even as a reader of what is labelled auto-fiction and a writer of it, I guess I'm still not completely clear myself on what that entails, because it isn't autobiography. It's definitely fiction, and yet elements of oneself are used carefully and aesthetically in making something new. And so the parts of my life that do overlap with Ida's are that I am a teacher. I'm a secondary teacher. I am from New Zealand. I do have a small child. I do have a partner. I do live in Melbourne. But between those details, there are still many things that were adjusted to fit the the needs of the novel, I suppose. It was always the kind of narrative shape that was driving that section, rather than it being just a kind of journal of that time of my life. Yeah, I absolutely did. I love the characters. I feel that, particularly reading back over it during the editing process, the sections that were written a long time ago that were kind of coming back to me that I'd sort of oddly forgotten about, was surprising in the best possible way, because they were familiar as sort of friends and family members, and yet still surprised me, which was um, so kind of satisfying as a kind of reader and editor of my own work. But I guess, like any project that's with you for a long time, you can also find them tiring and sort of frustrating as well. I love them, particularly now they're out in the world. What is next for me? I'm trying to write another novel, and in saying that, not a lot of writing has happened yet, but a lot of thinking has happened. I'm looking forward to, once the promotion of My Brilliant Sister has settled a little more, to getting some solid writing done, um, and to keeping up the momentum that has come with this novel. So more writing. Thank you so much for having me, Katy.